So my name is Freddie Alexander-Reid, and I'm the library manager here at Historic Environment Scotland. In our archives and library, we hold several million physical and digital records. These records span the scope of Scotland, from early brass plates depicting the city of Edinburgh to cutting-edge modern archaeological surveys discovering hidden Roman forts. We are the lead public body responsible for the preservation of the historic environment in Scotland. Now, what is the historic environment? We define it as the evidence of the interaction between people and their place. In Scotland, we can often picture this as striking castles or in magnificent prehistoric sites. However, the historic environment also includes Scotland's industrial heritage. There are obvious examples that stand out to us, such as the mills at New Lanark or the Forth Bridge, both of which are recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But these aren't the only examples of Scotland's industrial heritage. Or perhaps we could illustrate this in another way. If I was to leave my office in John Sinclair House in Edinburgh and take a train 15 minutes east to Preston Grange, I could visit the historic site of the Battle of Prestonpans of 1745, which was an important moment for the history of the Jacobites in Scotland. However, I would also be stood mere meters away from the rail line that serviced the Cockenzie coal yard. Importantly, both of these sites, separated by 250 years, have not left us buildings in our landscape to visit and study. Yet both of these sites have shaped Scotland's history. Like an onion, Scotland's history has many layers, and exploring and appreciating those different histories is something that I hope we can do in this presentation. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at the construction of the Cockenzie coal power station, the Longannet coal power station, and the nuclear power station at Hunterston B. The Scottish Power Collection in the Historic Environment Scotland archives consists of 201 photo albums. These albums depict the construction of power stations around Scotland, from the Stonebyres hydroelectric station in the 1920s to the Inverkip oil-powered station in the 1970s. These photographs, presumed to be professionally commissioned by the station, capture construction in incredible detail, often showing the same site element at monthly intervals, documenting the gradual construction of these enormous projects. In 2017, Historic Environment Scotland started its digital projects. One of the goals of this project was to digitize several prominent collections in our archive. During this project, we identified these Scottish Power photo albums as a candidate for digitization. We commissioned an external company to digitize the collection and then transferred the images into our digital archive. All of the images are currently available to view through our Canmore web resource, which will be linked in the presentation notes by Joe. In this collection, approximately half of the photo albums and images depict the construction of power stations at Cockenzie, Longannet, and Hunterston B. Because of their prominence in the collection, as well as their construction all starting within 5 years of each other, these stations become somewhat emblematic of the collection as a whole. Unfortunately, while the political history of coal power in Scotland and the UK is well documented, the industrial and engineering history, especially during the latter half of the 20th century, has not been collected in great detail. In researching this talk, I've been indebted to the work of my colleagues, Miles Oglethorpe and Miriam MacDonald, as well as primary documents created by organisations such as the South of Scotland Electricity Board. In general terms, up to 1946, the coal industry in Scotland can be characterised as a period of multiple unconsolidated mines and plants. In 1946, there were an estimated 1,470 collieries in Britain, of which 481 were small mines employing less than 30 persons. While nationalisation had been proposed by James Keir Hardie in 1893, it took the Reid Report in 1945 for the eventual nationalization of the industry under the Coal Industry Nationalization Act, as well as the creation of the National Coal Board. The primary focus for the National Coal Board was consolidating coal production in Scotland through closing less productive mines and increasing the workforce. Despite this, coal output in Scotland began a slow decline from 1950. The steepest drop in coal mining jobs in Scotland was actually in the 1960s, not the 1980s, as is commonly believed. This was due to a variety of factors, including declining domestic heavy industry users, conversion of locomotion to diesel and electricity, and competition from oil and natural gas. Clean air legislations in 1956 also calcified coal's reputation as a dirty fuel. By the 1970s, electricity generation became a primary demand on the coal industry. While in 1947, electricity generation accounted for only 15% of the coal market, by 1970, it accounted for half of the market. This put coal-based power stations in direct competition with the established Scottish tradition of hydroelectricity production and heavily subsidized nuclear power. At the same time, the national trend was towards increasingly large power stations. Steel frame buildings allowed for rapid construction and flexible development. An increasing demand for power encouraged new superstations. At the time of their construction, both Cockenzie and Longannet were the largest coal power stations in Scotland. Now, while this is a very general overview, it sets the scene for the period in which these three stations were being built. The first power station we're going to look at is the Cockenzie Power Station. Cockenzie is located on the south coast of the Forth, approximately 4 miles east of Musselburgh. South of Scotland Electricity Board literature for the period notes that Cockenzie received charter for its coal mining rights in 1210, the first of its kind in the country. Additionally, in 1722, the first railway in the UK was built in Cockenzie to service the local coal mine. The railway operated by a combination of horsepower and gravity at the time. Construction on the power station began in 1962. The South of Scotland Electricity Board was a publicly owned body, so these were not only huge industrial projects, but also large-scale public sector projects. In this picture, you can see the foundations for one of the chimneys. At the time, Cockenzie was scheduled to be the largest power station in Scotland, with 22,000 tons of structural steelwork comprising the main building. For context, the Eiffel Tower is constructed out of approximately 1/3 of this amount of steel. The station was designed to consume 12,000 tons of coal per day, which would be delivered into the station via an automated train system. As noted in the opening video, this automated system was called the merry-go-round. Each boiler would produce 2.05 million pounds of steam per hour, exiting the superheater section at 568 degrees Celsius. This would then be used to turn 4 identical 300 megawatt generating units, resulting in an output of 1,200 megawatts. One of the structural changes at Cockenzie was the introduction of a turbine automatic control equipment, or TACE. This allowed the main boiler feed pump and turbine to be started or shut down under automatic control from a central control room. The aim was to reduce the time taken for starting, loading, or shutdown, as well as reduce risk of maloperation. This was combined with the use of CCTV to monitor water levels in the boiler drums and an automated coal delivery and waste removal system in order to reduce the amount of staff required to operate the plant. Across the UK, there was a concern that these new superstations would become visually dominant on the landscape. As such, there was a growing desire to involve architects' firms in the planning and design of new power stations. The goal was that these new stations could be made somehow architecturally unobtrusive to their environment. Cockenzie was designed by the Robert Matthew and Stuart Johnson Marshall architects firm, whose archive we also hold at Historic Environment Scotland. In this, you can see the plans, elevations, and interior drawings for parts of the building. Matthew and Johnson Marshall were also involved in the other superstation on the north bank of the Forth, one which would eclipse Cockenzie as the largest coal station in Scotland. The Longannet power station was scheduled to be the largest single undertaking by the South of Scotland Electricity Board, and one of the largest engineering projects ever carried out in Scotland. The goal output was double that of Cockenzie at 2,400 megawatt, representing, quote, more than half of the total generating capacity of all the board's other power stations, end quote. This enormous project had specific geographical requirements for its construction. The station needed a large area of firm ground to support its weight, close proximity to a cold water source, and a location to dispose of coal ash. The 89-hectare depot at Longannet, previously a War Department ordnance depot, was identified for the site, with an additional 30 hectares of reclaimed land developed with coal ash from Kincardine. The average site is about over 200 football fields. Prior to construction, approximately 460,000 cubic meters of fuel ash and boulder clay were excavated from the site, and 100,000 cubic meters of sandstone were blasted for the foundation. In January 1970, the construction labor force reached its peak, employing 2,500 persons. 35,000 tons of Scottish steel went into the construction of the site. At completion, Longannet was the largest operative power station in Britain, and the 183-metre chimney was the tallest concrete structure in Scotland. At peak production, the station consumed 3,500 tons of coal per hour, delivered into the station on a 1.5-kilometre conveyor belt. Some sources claim that this conveyor was later extended to be the longest conveyor belt in Europe, although I've not been able to find a source that verifies that. Annually, the power station would burn between 5 and 6 million tons of coal, half of which was delivered by the Longannet mine complex. To cool the station, over 300,000 cubic meters of water was required to pass through it each hour. This water would then be discharged into the Forth. Prior to the construction of the station, a 140-meter physical model of the Forth was created to demonstrate how the water discharge would have no adverse impact on navigation or fishing. Regrettably, I've not been able to find out what happened to this model. One of the most visually striking parts of the construction at Longannet is probably the arrival of the boiler drum, which you can see just in the center of the image there. The boiler drum had to be transported into the station, maneuvered around the steelwork using cranes, lifted into position, so it could eventually be installed. And now just to take you back to this picture, I'm not exactly sure that this would pass for health and safety nowadays. Longannet became fully operational in 1973. During its 2 open days in May, a total of 18,000 people visited the station, which is pictured just here. As mentioned earlier, Longannet was also designed by Matthew and Marshall Johnson. As with Cockenzie, there was thought paid to the impact such a large structure would visually have on the environment. As such, the buildings were colored white for power on the turbine house, black for coal on the bunker bay, and gray for ash on the precipitators. The boiler house was fully glazed to allow for daylight to pass through, while from the outside, this cladding would reflect the color of the sky. The goal of this design was to soften the impact of the building and link it more closely with existing features on the landscape. The construction of power stations at Kincardine, Cockenzie, and finally Longannet resulted in a peculiar situation where power generation was heavily weighted in the east of Scotland. This was one of the factors that led to the proposal that a second nuclear power station should be built next to the existing site at Hunterston, North Ayrshire. The previous site, Hunterston A, had been opened in 1964. The power station was a Magnox-type nuclear power station, similar in design to the early nuclear power stations at Chapel Cross and Hinkley Point. In the first decades of its lifespan, Hunterston A was identified as one of the top-performing civil nuclear power stations in the world. The second station, named Hunterston B, was designed with an advanced gas-cooled reactor and was part of the second generation of UK nuclear power stations. The contemporary literature demonstrates a great deal of optimism for these types of reactors, noting that an AGR nuclear reactor consumes 40 tons of uranium per year, while an equivalent coal-fired station would consume 3 million tons of coal. Another comparison would be that one road-borne delivery of AGR fuel would provide the same amount of electricity as 16,000 lorry loads of coal at a conventional power station. Additionally, Hunterston B was pitched as being notably smaller than the neighboring Hunterston A, while producing almost 4 times as much electricity. Construction began on Hunterston B in 1967. Building the station was challenging, specifically as it required welded plates up to 3 inches thick. To achieve this, a specific welding school was established before site fabrication even began, and all welders were subjected to retraining before working on the site. Despite this, construction at Hunterston B was seriously delayed due to increased difficulties with thermal insulation, as well as industrial disputes. As such, the full station only came online in 1977, 10 years after construction began. Public perception of nuclear power had to be managed in this period as well. The station hosted several come and see days, as well as going out to deliver talks in the local communities. In our library, we hold a very interesting resource called Here Be No Dragons, a guide to the realities of nuclear power in Scotland. This document, produced by the South of Scotland Electricity Board, is a really fascinating insight into the climate around nuclear power in a period contemporary with the Chernobyl plant disaster. Interestingly, the book contains the following predictions. Given that the world is now using oil about 2 times faster than we are discovering it, and given that in the UK we will return to being a net importer of oil, possibly as early as the year 2000, oil will be less important as a fuel for electricity generation in the longer term. Nuclear and coal will form the basis of future generation, with coal increasingly being substituted for oil as a chemical feedstock. Despite their scale, many of these stations have since been demolished. Cockenzie ceased power generation on Friday, the 15th of March, 2013. Longannet closed in 2016, and Hunterston B began decommissioning in 2021. In 2014, 2 years before its closure, Longannet was ranked as the 21st dirtiest coal plant in Europe by the European Environmental Board. Hunterston B also struggled with dwindling support for nuclear power in the UK. Additionally, public perception towards power generation has affected our opinion of these sites. 3 days before the chimney stack was demolished, Scottish Power illuminated the slogan, "Make coal history onto the stack." Our growing understanding of the impact of burning fossil fuels in our environment, as well as a lack of investment in nuclear power, has colored our perception of these sites. Which leads us to a broader question about industrial heritage. What was the importance of these sites in telling Scotland's history? How do we relate to them now, especially after their destruction? English Heritage identified that coal and oil power stations are some of the most recognizable industrial complexes from the 20th century, reaching a, quote, unrivaled scale and level of technological sophistication by the 1960s, end quote. Certainly, Cockenzie and Longannet were amongst the largest national engineering projects ever to be conducted in Scotland. The tower at Longannet was one of the tallest structures in Scotland, behind the tower at the Inverkip coal power station. Both of these towers have since been demolished. For a sense of scale, this map from the Matthew and Stuart and Johnson Marshall collection depicts the area at which the Longannet Tower would be visible. As you can see, this area includes much of West Lothian and southwest Fife, from Bannockburn in the west to Dunfermline in the east. These sites hold multiple stories about Scottish industry, engineering, and architecture. While they may be seen as a high point for power station design, we can also see them as indicative of coal's declining influence in Scotland and a longer trend of coal power stations being centralized into fewer, larger stations. But without the footprint of these buildings, what can we do to interrogate that history? In the absence of buildings, archive and museum evidence often remains the only long-term record for power stations in Scotland. Because of this, collections like the Scottish Power Station albums at Historic Environment Scotland, they're important records. Looking into the future, these records will become a rare touchstone for a period in Scottish industrial history that has shaped, for better and for worse, our economy, society, and climate. I'm excited by the further research opportunities that may come as a result of this collection. In addition to these construction photographs and architects' plans from the Matthew and Johnson Marshall architects, we also hold additional construction photographs compiled by the Sir William Arrell and Company Limited, who were part of the consortium involved in the construction at Cockenzie and Longannet. Combining all of these resources may illuminate more about the construction and engineering history for these power stations. Additionally, as an archivist by trade, I'm interested in the questions about what are the missing voices in an archive collection. The captions of these photo albums focus on the construction of the stations, but there are many people pictured across the albums. This is a very interesting gap in the collection as these people aren't named, and the social labor history of what it was like to work on these sites may be a subject for research in the future. We've included original captions for the photos of Cockenzie, Longannet, and Hunterston B. An export of all of these captions can be requested from the archives to help navigate the collection, as well as drawing links across the photo albums. For instance, here's the administrative block at Cockenzie, being built in January of 1964, January of 1965, and June of 1968. We are continuing to improve item-level records across the collection, which will help further research into different power stations across Scotland. You can view all of the images I've shared in this presentation, as well as many more, on our Canmore web resource. Equally, if you're interested in viewing the physical albums, you can request a consultation in our Edinburgh search room.